Greetings, comrades! Today is Valentine's Day, so we are going to talk about love. There is no sex in the USSR. These words, spoken by participants in the Leningrad-Boston teleconference in 1986, instantly became a catchphrase. Opponents of the USSR inside the country used it as an example that censorship is so unhinged that it forbids even such natural forms of human relationships. In the US, they laughed at the phrase and thought, well, maybe not everything in our country is perfect, but hey, those Russians don't even have sex. Let us once and for all put an end to the question, was there sex in the USSR? There is an opinion that it's hard to find a more anti-sexual culture than the Soviet one. But excuse me, how then can we explain the processions of totally naked men and women through the center of Soviet Moscow?
Oh no!
Yes, actually the phrase was originally "we don't have sex" and referred to the sexualization of women in advertising. More specifically to the question, do you even have advertising in the USSR?
Have a lot to do with sex in our country. Do you have commercials on your television?
In our country, we're categorically against that. We don't have sex in our country.
And to be even more precise, according to the editors of the program, her phrase fully sounded like "we don't have sex, we have love." But the ending was drowned out by the audience in the studio. But who cares when the phrase has such huge meme potential? All the more so because with her answer, Lyudmila Ivanova unwittingly hit the mark. The topic of sex and carnal relations between men and women in general was taboo in the Soviet Union, almost as much as the topic of religion. Which is funny, the USSR did so much to eradicate all these orthodox dogmas in the country, but in this very sphere the state behaved in a way that any strict Puritan society would be jealous of. How did this happen? Why did the USSR so stubbornly ignore the topic of sexual relations, and how did it still penetrate the minds of ordinary Soviet citizens, especially at the very beginning of the Union's life cycle and at its end? Let's put it this way. Was the USSR such a prudish country because of some philosophical and ideological concerns? Most likely not. It was more about the state's desire to control every aspect of its citizens' lives, even in their own bedrooms. At the same time, the authorities understood that they were unable to fully control the intimate life of every Soviet person, so it was easier for them to ignore or even conceal any manifestation of sexuality. Although initially it was quite the opposite, and this is demonstrated by the atmosphere of the 1920s, when the society was fully embracing the fresh ideas of communism. The October Revolution led not only to a regime change, but also to a fundamental shift in culture. The Bolsheviks wanted to change the entire way of life of the country and mankind, which means that practically everything turned 180 degrees. What were the three pillars of Imperial Russia's ideology? Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Nationality was destroyed. Now all people were not Russians, Ukrainians or Georgians, but Soviet. The autocracy was destroyed radically, back in 1918 in some dirty basement. Orthodoxy. Destroy all the temples. But orthodoxy is not only in the temples, it's in the heads. And what does commandment number 7 tell us?
15! 10 commandments!
Thou shalt not commit adultery. Let's make a complete U-turn. In the 20s, free love reigned in the USSR. The prohibitions and restrictions of pre-revolutionary times were gone. The Bolsheviks made divorce much easier, decriminalized homosexuality, and legalized abortion. Incidentally, the USSR was the first country in the world to do so. In the new society, the traditional institution of family and marriage was considered a bourgeois remnant, an evil relic of the nation's Tsarist past. Marriage lost its sacred nature and became exclusively civil, while sexual relationships without marriage were no longer considered reprehensible. In addition, the Bolsheviks insisted that oppression, inequality and exploitation must be eradicated not only in social but also in sexual relationships. This means that women became equal to men in this aspect. Cheating or relations outside marriage were not considered something unforgivable for them. The theory of the glass of water, which was once promoted by Alexander Kollontai and Clara Zetkin, was popular. According to this theory, sexual relations were similar to any other physiological act, such as quenching thirst. There is no love, only instinctive need, they believed. Many people have also heard of the idea of communes, where everything was shared: housing, food, belongings, sexual partners. There was no division into couples among the residents of the communes. Everyone had the right to sleep with everyone. The Soviet youth of the 1920s embraced such changes with great enthusiasm and fervor. In fact, a sexual revolution took place in the country, half a century earlier than anywhere else. One doesn't have to look too far for examples. The poetic icon of the revolution, Vladimir Mayakovsky, lived openly with a Greek couple, Lilia and Osip. And here is a photo of an ordinary nudist beach in the late 1920s, right under the walls of the Kremlin. In just 5 years, such a thing will be impossible to imagine. Finally, my favorite story is about the society down with shame, which took the creation of the new type of people slogan too close to heart. It did not exist for long, but it left vivid memories in the minds of its contemporaries. Alexander Trushnovich described the society's activities as follows: completely naked, adorned only with a ribbon with the inscription "Down with Shame," an orator in the square of Krasnodar shouted from the rostrum, "Down with bourgeoisie! Down with priestly deceptions! We communards do not need clothes to cover the beauty of our bodies. We are children of the sun and the air." Walking there in the evening, I saw a broken rostrum. The child of the sun and the air had been beaten up. In general, there are a lot of written memories about the society, but no video or photo can be found. Perhaps there are materials in secret state archives. Mikhail Bulgakov recalled how members of the society climbed naked into streetcars. There is evidence of mass naked demonstrations in Moscow, Kharkov and Saratov. And not with hooligan motives, but with a firm ideological basis. We have destroyed the sense of shame. Look at us and see free men and women, true proletarians who have thrown off the shackles of bourgeois prejudice symbols. Unfortunately, these movements soon disappeared on its own, and the country swung drastically in the opposite direction, towards the most conservative perception of male-female relations. They say that Stalin was responsible for this. The leader was a man of traditional values and was outraged by all this manifestation of the new sexual freedom. This may be true. Even in the early 1920s there were heated debates within the party about how to interpret communist ideology in the area of sexual relations. The main argument against free sex was that sexual energy should be redirected toward more noble social goals. As a result, by the end of the 1920s, the conservative wing had finally won, deciding that sexual promiscuity leads to all sorts of antisocial behavior. In 1926, Nikolai Bukharin, a member of the Central Committee, made a speech entitled "The Struggle for Human Resources," in which he called for the creation of a moral code for the Komsomol, and especially to fight sexual promiscuity. And 2 years earlier, the psychiatrist Aron Zalkin had even issued some sort of guidelines for Soviet people, the 12 sexual commandments of the revolutionary proletariat, which included points such as sexual intercourse should not be repeated frequently, and love relationships should not include elements of flirting, courtship, coquetry, and other methods of specifically sexual conquest. Now it sounds ridiculous, but looking back, one can realize that the USSR built its policy in this matter according to these very precepts. The whole theory and practice of sex education in families and schools was based on them. The sexual freedom of the 1920s proved to be too dangerous for the state. The institution of marriage and motherhood was decaying, and the demographic situation worsened. As a result, from the mid-30s to the mid-50s, abortions were banned in the country, on pain of criminal liability. Otherwise, the authorities began to enforce the system with moral condemnation. Personal life became public. If a person behaved inappropriately in the opinion of colleagues or superiors, the situation was brought up for discussion at a general meeting of the community.
What's this? Huh?
The reason for discussion could be almost anything: adultery, quarrels, and even just frivolous behavior. Any manifestation of immorality could be met with expulsion from the party, a very harsh measure. Families were now expected to maintain the appearance of well-being despite any disagreements. Divorce was seen as a shameful stain on the biography of both spouses. Mass culture also asserts new norms of personal life. In movies, characters who are lacking consistency in love relationships are portrayed as exclusively negative characters, or at least as people who are not accepted by society. Books containing erotic scenes are banned. Any erotic photo is considered pornography, which is already a criminal offense. As a result, the topic of sex became strictly taboo, both in society and even inside each family. Even having some kind of conversation about birds and bees in many Soviet families was unacceptable. What an embarrassing topic. At the same time, schools had lessons on ethics and psychology of family life, how to behave with others, how to build a family life, bring up children, respect each other, but the topic of sexual relations was avoided, as well as the topic of how to attract a person of the opposite sex. The idea that attractiveness equals excess, bourgeoisness, unnecessary bliss was firmly embedded in the minds of Soviet people. Builders of communism should not be distracted by such things. This can be illustrated perfectly by the example of women's underwear. Women's underwear was not designed to seduce. It had to be simply hygienic, practical, and warm. In such underwear, a woman was ready to work, to fulfill the 5-year plan in 4 years. Soviet women could buy only 2 to 3 types of underpants and only 1 model of bras. But pantaloons! Cotton and woolen with fleece for winter. Practicality. Exquisite foreign lingerie was almost impossible to obtain, and what was produced in the USSR did not emphasize any advantages of the body. Even by the early 60s, not much had really changed. Here's a scene from The Girls movie, 1961. This kind of manifestation of feelings is pretty much the maximum of what could be seen in Soviet cinema at the time. Usually, lovers in movies talked about industrial achievements of the state, not about their feelings. It was only towards the end of the decade that this topic became at least a little less taboo on the screens. Here's Svetlana Svetlichny in The Diamond Arm. Insanely provocatively bold scene for those times brought her the title of one of the first Soviet sex symbols. Or the revolutionary bath scene from the movie The Dawns Here Are Quiet, although because of the tragic nature of the plot there was no sexual subtext here. However, if we talk about movies, then by the end of the Union's lifetime the pendulum swung in the opposite direction. Movies of the late 80s and especially the early 90s are some kind of fierce mix of unimaginable vulgarity, where almost no movie could do without a bad scene. The more raunchy and shocking, the better. However, this was not only seen in the movies. Along with freedom and Glasnost, the country was hit by a wave of rising teenage pregnancies, prostitution, STDs, and other joys. A side effect of freedom, so to speak. Although all these, of course, existed before Gorbachev. It is just that it became acceptable to talk about it openly only after 1985. Suffice it to recall the famous elite stratum of intergirls, prostitutes of the 70s and 80s who lived near hotels inhabited by foreigners and specialized on them. According to rumors, some of them also played the role of informants for KGB agents, who were supposed to monitor the contacts of foreigners in the country. I've gone a bit off on underwear, movies. Let's get back to how people in the USSR perceived the subject of sex as taboo, as one that was not to be discussed. Even the very word sex and any words related to sexual intercourse were considered indecent. At most one could hear "let's make love", and usually semi-understandable euphemism and vague innuendos were used to describe the process. In the middle of the life cycle of the Soviet Union, sex disappeared from public discussion altogether. In that sense, yes, there was no sex in the USSR. Then again, let's bring up my favorite topic of Soviet housing. What kind of sex was there in communal houses or barracks in the 40s and 50s? Especially if the family already had children. Zero privacy in such conditions. At the same time, after Stalin, the country at least became somewhat concerned about basic education of its citizens in sexual matters, slight relaxation of censorship in movies and literature, appearance of sub-educational books for adults and teenagers. All this was emerging, but very slowly. Even condoms in the USSR were unique, Soviet condoms produced by several factories. Although buying condoms was still a bit shameful. It is hard to imagine that the Soviet citizens could openly discuss the characteristics of the product and compare it with other samples. Lubricant? Dear God, what's that?
Alright! No, not alright!
The Soviet unofficial name for condoms is also amusing. Rubber product number 2. Product number 1 was the gas mask. Other popular erotic objects were playing cards with naked women, homemade, clippings from foreign magazines smuggled into the country, and if someone could somehow get a videotape with erotica, for example, the famous Emmanuel, I think it was quite possible to trade it, if not for a ladder, then for a sidecar from a motorcycle, certainly. In general, there was sex in the USSR, of course, but nobody wanted to talk about it. And the state supported it in every possible way. It was absurd. At school, most girls did not know what menstruation was, and when they got their first period, they thought they would bleed to death. Some husbands and wives were too embarrassed to discuss their own sex life even with each other. I even read a story of a woman in labor and delivery screaming at doctors, "Is the baby coming out from there? I thought it will come out of my belly." On the other hand, if the Soviet society was not fixated on sex, then maybe it was less of an issue and people were more romantic. Or at least communism was built more efficiently under those conditions. I don't think so. A true Komsomol member of the 1920s would have regarded his mid-20th century followers as bourgeois retrogrades, steeped in religious prejudice. So what was it all for? Apparently, Stalin and his supporters decided that sexual freedom was too dangerous. That a powerful and united society can be built only based on strong units, and such a unit should be not a progressive commune mired in carnal pleasures, but a traditional family, which at the same time is minimally distracted by sex, and more thinking about how to fulfill a monthly plan at the factory. In general, it was excellently described in a pathetic novel We by Yevgeny Zamyatin.
No! God, please, no!
Yes, I know. Comparing the Soviet Union and dystopias is the height of banality, but it's true. The ideal society of the future with an emphasis on work and productivity. Strict regulation of sexual life as a means of social unification, pink cards for sex issued by the state, sex is taboo outside the supervision of the state, except that the writer miscalculated with the right of every person on every person. It remained in the 1920s. Oh, yes, it was all about traditional sexual relationships. But what about non-traditional ones? Well, of course, there were such people in the USSR, although it was carefully hushed up. You were all expecting Brezhnev's kisses, weren't you? But no, that's too hackneyed. So let's take a look at these beautiful and absolutely not homoerotic posters about Russian-Chinese friendship, and say that non-traditional relationships in the Soviet Union were punishable by prison time in accordance with Article 121 Sodomy, introduced in 1926. Prison up to 5 years. At least 38,000 people fell victim to this article between 1946 and 1991 alone. As Lev Trotsky said, undoubtedly sexual oppression is the main tool of human enslavement. Lenin echoed him. All prohibitions concerning sexuality must be lifted. By the way, he also said something about lifting the ban on same-sex relations, but with the new laws in my country I suggest you to find this phrase yourself.
If I speak, I am in big trouble. In big trouble.
LGBT is bad. Do not recommend it. So, it would seem that after Lenin's death and Trotsky's expulsion from the country, the Soviet Union should have listened to Vladimir Ilyich. But in the end, it chose a different path. The path of the very sexual oppression that the demon of the revolution had warned about. Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Berze, Jimmy Albin, Eli, Petr Ilich and Bruce Etzelnik. See you guys next time.